Good morning, Odyssey Church family, and anyone else who might be with us this morning. Thank you so much for joining us as we continue through the book of James, looking at wisdom for living life well. This morning we'll be looking at making plans and looking to the future and what James has to say about planning ahead in a way that is pleasing to God. So thinking about the future always makes me think of one of my favorite movie series, Back to the Future, specifically the second movie where they travel forward in time to the year 2015. So the movie is set in the year 1985 and it was released in the year 1987, and they travel 30 years into the future to the year 2015, and there are all sorts of crazy futuristic predictions going on in that movie. There are flying cars, they're self-tying shoelaces, all the kids are riding hoverboards and all these crazy things. I'm pretty sure Jaws 17 is on in cinemas or something like that, and all these crazy predictions and weird inventions going on in the future. And for me, when I was 15 years old and first watched the film, it was in the year 2015, and I just couldn't help but look around and think, well, a lot of the stuff that's going on here isn't at all what life is like now in 2015, and it was quite amusing, and I just couldn't help but kind of laugh at how wrong the image of the future was. So we can take two things from looking at this movie as an example. Firstly, it's easy for us to overestimate our capacity to bring about change, and it's even more easy for us to neglect to account for unforeseeable events in the future. James teaches that making plans without getting a full picture of the will of God isn't only foolish, but actually arrogant and can be ultimately harmful. So today we'll be looking at what James has to say about making plans which are pleasing to God and therefore life-giving. So we'll start by quickly looking at how the passage fits into James's letter as a whole before diving into three main points regarding planning. So James chapter 4 verse 13 to 17 says, "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." James highlights in this passage that we ought to humbly seek God in our decision making and allow him to determine the course of our life. One of the overarching themes in the letter of James is the role that speech plays in our lives. The passage preceding this one was James' teaching on that which leads to strife and division, which he outlined as pride. He points out that our pride can be seen in the way that we speak to and treat others, and it stems from a desire to pursue our own interests over and above the will of God. James highlights that the way to deal with pride is to submit to God and draw near to him. And in the passage that we're looking today, James demonstrates how pride can come into our lives in the way that we plan for what is to come without grounding those plans in the will of God. He refers to this as boasting, that is, taking pride in our own ability to control an outcome without being mindful of God. So first we'll be looking at the plans of man and the reality of life. So James introduces this passage by voicing disapproval of those who make plans on their own terms and don't include God in the picture. Now, it's important to clear up that there's absolutely nothing wrong with planning ahead. In fact, we're taught and encouraged to do so. Planning in itself is by no means wrong, as long as we come to God and trust him to bring about the course of those plans and the outcomes of those plans. The problem lies when we make plans solely to gratify our own desires and leave God completely out of the picture. So in verse 14, James highlights the folly of this type of thinking. He explains that leaving God out of the decision making isn't only foolish, but arrogant. He reminds us that in fact we have a very small view of reality. He reminds us that life is uncertain and complex when he says, we do not know what tomorrow will bring. He also reminds us that life is transient and short when he says, for you are but a mist that appears for a small time and then vanishes. James challenges the way we look at our lives by asking, what is your life? In other words, he challenges listeners to consider the significance or the purpose of their lives. And in essence, James is saying, well, come on, you who make plans, you don't even know just how little control you have over life itself. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, and we don't even know how long we'll be here on earth for. This is why we're told to number our days, or to live our lives as if each day was our last. God has a greater purpose for our lives, one that is rooted in spreading to the reaches of his kingdom, which leads to a fullness of life. And as those who trust in God, we need to acknowledge that our lives aren't our own and that God has a purpose for each of our lives. If we were to turn back the clock to last year, 2019, I'm sure many of us had all sorts of plans for this year, 2020. And I'm sure if people had been told that there would be a pandemic which would cause an extended emergency lockdown, people would have had completely different plans. But at the end of the day, we have no means of telling the future, and it's easy to overestimate our ability to control the desired outcome. So if this lockdown has taught us anything, it's just how little control we have over our own futures. So we're called to root our plans in the will of God, because we're not the masters of our own fate. So secondly, we're going to be looking at what James outlines as the ideal response to this idea of making plans for the future. So in verse 15, James gives an example of what the correct heart posture should be towards making plans when he says, if the Lord wills. Now with this phrase, it's important to note that James isn't saying that this is just something that we can stick on the end of a prayer after we've already made our plans, as if it's magically going to bless whatever we've done, whatever plans we've come up with, but rather it's a call to root our vision and decision making around the will of God, rather than around our own desires, rather than around a reliance on our own personal capacity, and rather than on an assumption of what tomorrow will bring. So James stresses that this is a heart attitude. In Proverbs 16 verse 9, we're taught that the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. And then in Proverbs 3 verse 5 to 6, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. So planning is by no means wrong. Presumptuous planning, however, is. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we'll always get a clear step-by-step, play-by-play plan for each moment in our lives, but rather we're encouraged to ask God for direction, acknowledge his sovereign will, and wholeheartedly depend on God for the realization of an intended goal or an outcome. So if you were to imagine this practically, let's say you were drawing up your plans for the next week or the next month, and you had a pencil and a paper and an eraser in front of you. God doesn't want you to simply leave the page blank, never pick up the pencil, and just kind of leave it all up to him. But rather, he wants you to allow him to hold the eraser so that he can come in and adjust what he needs to. So the ideal heart posture is one that is wholly submissive and reliant on God for an outcome of a plan over and above self-gratification and self-serving. Thirdly and finally, let's look at what James says about not letting God hold the eraser. So after pointing out the ideal, James addresses once again the severity of what it means to make presumptuous plans. He defines it as arrogant boasting and says that all such boasting is evil. When we pursue our own wills without submitting to God, we give space for evil to come into our lives. This goes back to what James was saying earlier on in the chapter in verses 1 to 6. When we allow room for pride, we allow room for hurt and pain to be propagated. On the one hand, presumptuous planning often leads to disappointment, but on the other hand, even more than that, it can have severe consequences which can affect ourselves and those around us. When we fail to submit to God, we give space for the enemy of our souls to come in and influence our desires and block our vision of Jesus. We allow him a space and a foothold in our hearts where he can blind us to the effects of what he's doing, since he causes us to fixate on our own desires and gratifying them. James concludes this passage with the phrase, "Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." He highlights in the context that failing to rely on God is fundamentally sinful, meaning that we miss the mark and flat out rebel against God. This is called the sin of omission. If we omit the author of life when we plan, then we make space for the evil one to spread his influence in our lives. John 10 verse 10 says that the enemy of our souls has come to steal, kill, and destroy, but that God, in the person of Jesus, has come so that we can have life, and life to the full. God doesn't wish to put a damper on our plans. In fact, he desires for us to have a fullness of life, which comes from relationship with him and leads to life-giving relationship with others. When we submit to God and draw near to him, we're then strengthened, envisioned, and set up to live that life of fullness that he has in store for us. Napoleon Bonaparte, when he was about to invade Russia, had someone come up to him and try to discourage him from doing so. When this person realized that they weren't getting anywhere, they quoted to Napoleon saying, "Man proposes, but God disposes." Napoleon pridefully and indignantly replied, "Well, I dispose as well as propose." Another person hearing this marked that this was the turn of Napoleon's fortunes. And it turns out that that man was on target, because Russia was the beginning of Napoleon's fall. For a man to boast of a future that he has no knowledge of, this boasting is sin. And it's foolish to have the attitude of, "I'm in control, I don't need God, my way is best." God can dispose what we propose. Our boasting and pride can ruin us and make us ineffective for Christ. It robs us of the ability to be a blessing to the people around us. So in conclusion, James teaches us that it's completely natural to make plans for the future, but that it can be entirely destructive if we don't submit those plans to God. Failing to submit our plans to God not only leads to disappointment, but can end up hurting the people around us. Submitting our plans to God is allowing him to have the final say in our lives. And as the author of life and the source of love and the source of all that's good in our lives, we're called to depend on him so that he can give us a fullness of life, so that we can be led into being a blessing to the people around us. All of us fall short and miss the mark. All of us at some stage have presumed to have God on our side, but failed to truly depend on him in the planning process. But our loving Father sent his Son to die so that no matter how many times we stumble, we can draw near to him and receive grace. You might feel, especially in the last 6 months of this lockdown, that your plans have been completely thrown out the window, leaving you disappointed and disillusioned. I want to encourage you to take this moment to stop, go to God, and ask him to have his way in your life. Use this time to draw near to him and receive grace from the one who loves you. Thank you so much once again for joining us. We hope you have a blessed week, and we'll see you next time.